it was first by chance.
Mhm.
I just saw a copy of this book by Hillman in a bookstore in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I was there in my capacity as a theoretical biologist, or at least I wanted to be one. And I just picked up the book by chance. But my background before then was kind of mixed, because I had an undergraduate degree in philosophy and could never quite manage to get further than that. And I went to graduate school, tried to get a PhD a couple of times, and it just wasn't right for me. And so eventually, after working in the real world for about 10 years as a carpenter, I went back to school in the sciences, and I tried to do physics, and then I tried to do biology, which I was very happy with. I had this mixed background, both in the humanities and natural sciences. And when I when I chanced upon Hillman's book, it just looked like it might be interesting. And within a few months, I started reading it, and I was just stunned, because I thought, well, you know what he does? He puts imagination at the center of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, at the time, I thought, this is what I've been looking for all my life. Because I found so many things interesting, but they all were, pretty narrow. And I wanted, I didn't realize all of this immediately, but 30 years later, I needed some way of bridging those divides. The way academia gets broken up into disciplines. And although I was a long way from understanding all this in 1990, there was something about Hillman that just thrilled me. And then I was also going through an extremely difficult psychological time. I was 38 years old, and Jung and Jungians will tell you that very often when you hit 40 or so, your life starts to get complicated and confusing. And as my psyche began to collapse around me, I recognized that Hillman and the Jungians were the only people that I was aware of that took that kind of psychic distress really seriously. And so, just to compress a long story, I found a Jungian analyst who helped me quite a bit over the years. But to continue with the more or less impersonal part of the story, but the fact of the matter is that for anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff, it's never academic and impersonal. You're interested in it because it changes your life. And so while that was going on, I continued to read Hillman, and he took mythology seriously. He took, in his own peculiar way, he took religion seriously. He took dreams and poetry and images were all just, for him, it was the ground of everything. And I just found that extremely liberating. And to begin to be able to think about what imagination might mean in the broadest possible sense. And then, and I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was probably after I'd been reading nothing but Hillman for a couple of years, I chanced upon his essay, The Thought of the Heart. And right at the beginning of that, he talks about Henry Corbin. And what he says is just so astounding. I thought, wow, well, I guess I should know about this Corbin person. If my hero thinks he's just the greatest proponent of the imagination that he knows, then I got to find out about it. So I bought myself a copy of his book on Ibn Arabi, and I started to read it. And right away, and for a long time thereafter, I was both attracted and repelled.
Hmm.
Because remember, I'm coming from philosophy in the 1970s and sciences. And though I had a proclivity for metaphysics rather than analytic philosophy, um, reading Corbin was just not what the kind of thing I was used to doing. He starts with angels and the Bible and the Quran and medieval thought. And yet Hillman told me this guy is the real deal. And so I'd read a bit and put it down, read a bit and put it down. I was just so conflicted for a really long time, but for whatever reason, and I don't really understand it, but there was something in the book that I had to know, as I put it many times subsequently, I had to know where this guy was standing. What was he doing? I mean, and why was he important to Hillman? And and then I began to learn a little bit about his life, which briefly is that he was known to most people as a scholar of Islamic mysticism. But earlier in his life, it was pretty clear that he could have been either a scholar of German theology and philosophy, or for that matter, Catholic medieval philosophy. This guy was astonishingly broad in his grounding, and he was also something of a mystic. And I think that comes across in that first book, at least a little bit. And so that was super interesting to me. I discovered that, he knew Karl Barth, and then the thing that really caught me is I discovered he was the first French translator of Heidegger.
Mhm.
And then I was stuck because when I was a kid, I thought those German philosophers were really where it was at. And I thought, what on earth is going on here? But then, if you read the first page of his book on Ibn Arabi really carefully, he talks about phenomenology. And so I went back and I thought, oh my God, he means that phenomenology. He means Husserl and Heidegger. And I eventually, within a couple of years, I discovered that at the same time he was translating Shuravardi, the 12th century Persian mystic, he was reading Heidegger and translating Heidegger. And my favorite anecdote about Corbin is that his copy of Being in Time, which of course was in the original German, was annotated in the margins in Persian and Arabic. Ah, I mean, who is this guy and what is he doing? And 30 years later, I kind of know a little bit, but I don't have the languages to know this. I now know many people who do have those languages, but I never will. Um, but what Hillman saw in Corbin was this astonishingly broad-minded and deeply passionate philosopher and theologian of what Corbin called the Abrahamic tradition. And he knew contemporary European philosophy and theology exceedingly well. And for a variety of reasons, he turned towards Persian, particularly Persian Islamic mysticism. And he never converted to Islam. That's a very important thing. He was kind of a post-Islamic, liberal, maybe Protestant Christian. He had a vision of the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and also for Corbin, Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia. And he saw them as one great construct of, I'll say, the human imagination, because that's true. But the human imagination is only important because it participates in the divine imagination. So, just to wrap up that, for Corbin, as for Ibn Arabi, in a very real sense, everything is imagination. And I was hooked.
Yeah, given the breadth of Corbin's spectrum, and we have to narrow the segment. And I think I'll go through the archetypal psychology, because that's the most
Sure.
So you say that he's one of the in one of the passages of your book, you mention Nietzsche as a distant predecessor, Jung and Corbin as the forefathers of the archetypal psychology. Could you please sort of elaborate that, put Corbin into that triangle, Nietzsche,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. So for me, they form a kind of a spectrum. So right from my first engagement with Hillman, I have always been most interested in thinking about the imagination. What is it? What does it mean? How should we understand it? Because lots of people understand it very differently. And Jung and Hillman and Corbin all share this really profound sense that the imagination is pretty much everything, and yet they're quite different. Jung, here's the compressed version, which doesn't do justice to any of them, because I think all three of them are really creative thinkers in a way that makes it rightly impossible to pigeonhole them. But I'll do it anyway. So Jung is, we now know a lot more about Jung than we did, even a couple decades ago, because we've got the Red Book. So we know that Jung had his own quasi-psychosis for a long time. And I will never get over my astonishment at the fact that he managed to hold it together and to create this astonishing psychological theory and practice. So we know that he had the most intense experiences of the reality of the psyche for a long time. And so he's there's a mystical side to Jung, and he loved the alchemy as a means of understanding these extremely lively influxes from the unconscious. But he needed, for social and cultural reasons, he needed to put that in some sort of container that would be acceptable to other people. So he never becomes a real prophet. He doesn't go and be a religious prophet. And he's always, I think, a little bit conflicted because he wants to be taken seriously by scientists and psychologists. And that, I think, causes a bit of ambivalence and some conflicts in Jung's work overall. when Corbin came to the Ernos conferences in '54, they hit it off right away because they saw in each other this profound sense of the realities of the imagination and a profound that they shared a kind of what both of them would call a Gnosticism, a sense that they had seen things that other people hadn't. But Corbin, as opposed to Jung, he doesn't care about psychology. He's worried about psychology because he doesn't want to get too close to psychological terminology because he's a mystical theologian. Period. He has no interest in the sciences because he's worried that, as they often do, they will try to reduce his experiences of the transcendent to history and the material and the social. So where Jung is always a little bit conflicted about how to approach the reality of God, for instance, Corbin doesn't have any of those concerns. He once said to Robert Bosnak, late in Corbin's life, he said, all of my contemporaries have been dead for 1,000 years. And that's not Jung. Jung is very much the psychologist and the practitioner and the lover of many women, um, you know, um, and he's really right there in 20th century Switzerland, and Corbin isn't in this peculiar way. So though they share this Gnosticism, they part ways there. So you never see that kind of conflict in Corbin's sense of the meaning of the imagination. In his doctrine of the Mundus Imaginalis, he's not worried about what the scientists might think about that. So it gives his whole opus a very different flavor, a very different feeling, which we can come back to this, which I think for modern people makes it a little problematic. Hillman has, for me, always been somewhere in the middle, because he doesn't give a damn about psychology or the sciences, really. He was a practicing psychologist for all those years, but pretty early on, he's really a Renaissance Neoplatonist in the body of a 20th century psychologist. And so his version of Jungian, and actually, yeah, and so his version of Jungianism is not conflicted in the way that Jung's is. Somebody asked Hillman when he was giving a lecture fairly late in his own life. They were referring to his mode of analysis, which always involved images and all that sort of stuff. And somebody said, well, what about drugs? What about antidepressants and that sort of thing? And he said, fine, I have no problem. Bring in everything, anything. I don't care. Anything is fine. Of course, he said, there's room for everything. And that was always the version of Hillman that attracted me so much. He was theoretically and practically kind of a crazy American. He wasn't a systematic thinker in any sense. And this is sort of interesting, I think, to compare the three. There was a part of Jung who very much liked the systematic way of approaching it, and thus we get Jungianism and the Jung Institute and the feeling functions, and he set that all up. And when Hillman speaks explicitly about those aspects of Jungianism, he's always sort of critical of Jungianism as an ism. and he's got this inbred distaste for anything which is um, um, organized. Here's another. This is interesting because Corbin, in a funny way, shares some of Hillman's anti-institutionalism, which goes into the triad, So there's overlaps and to say a little more about Hillman. Well, let me put this in because it expresses my understanding and my reading of both Hillman and Jung. When I was during those years psychologically very fragile, when I was feeling threatened, I would read Jung, got the ego and the structures and the functions. And when I was feeling trapped, I would read Hillman because anything can happen and everything's exciting and don't worry about your ego and anything goes. And Hillman is just always so free flowing. And Jung's got that sort of conservative Swiss in him. And sometimes you need one and sometimes you need another. And so that's how I managed them. Psychotherapeutically, Corbin's let's see, how am I going to say this? Psychotherapeutically, it looks on the surface that Corbin is not so useful because he's not a psychotherapist. He doesn't write about what you should do. But if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a story about Corbin and my relation to Corbin, which was initiatory if you want to read it that way, in a psychological sense, in the sense of psychology that Jung and Hillman both are interested in, because although I had a handful of analysts over the years, I still, until quite late in this decades-long process, I had this kernel of nihilistic negativity, and we don't need to talk about why, but I kind of know why. And it was bad. And typical analysis hadn't worked. And I didn't know what was going on at the time, but Corbin and Ibn Arabi saved my soul. And I could not possibly have accessed Corbin without the precursors of both Jung and Hillman. Because in our psychological lives, as in life in general, you need permissions. At least I sure did. I needed permission to enter Corbin's world of religion. I couldn't. I tried and couldn't convert to Christianity. I tried. I thought maybe I could become a Sufi. No, none of it was going to work. But what did work, I was saved from the only way to say this is either to write a whole book about it or to say it very briefly. You'll get the brief version. I was saved from that nihilism by an anecdote that Ibn Arabi tells and that Corbin reworks in his book on Ibn Arabi. So Ibn Arabi is circumambulating the Kaaba and he's having a moment of doubt. This is Ibn Arabi, arguably the greatest mystic known to humanity. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, what if those divine presences are gone? What if something bad has happened to them and they're gone? That would be nihilism, the way I was reading it. That would be very early in my life. I had this moment where I thought, oh, there is no God. And, whoosh, things went downhill from there for, 40 or 50 or gosh, I think 55 years. And then I'm reading Corbin talking about that moment of doubt. And so what happens to Ibn Arabi is his Sophia figure appears to him. And this is a young woman named Nizam. And there's a long story there, which because I have some problems with this kind of relationship. But anyway, the figure of Nizam appears to Ibn Arabi, and Corbin tells us in American English, what she says is, wait a minute, you think they're gone? What's wrong with you? It's not their problem. They're fine. You're the one with the problem. Now, if I could say that I was instantly saved from my, which isn't true. I had to work this over for days, maybe weeks. I don't really remember. But what she was doing in my reading was saying, "My God, how inflated in Jungian terms! You think there's something wrong with the divinities? what what kind of powers do you think you have? You're just this little knuckle-headed person, and you're just depressed, man. Get over it." For whatever reasons, well, because I think it was that anecdote was inside a setting in which it simply worked for me, and it allowed me in the end to see that we could put it this way, because I think this is crucial to this kind of framing of reality is crucial to understanding probably all three of them, but particularly Hillman and Corbin. To think that you understand reality and to be so sure of it is just the worst thing that could happen to a human being, because you don't know anything. Corbin wrote a whole paper about this towards the end of his life, and it's called Apophatic Theology as the Antidote to Nihilism. and that's essentially what that little anecdote is about, because his figure of Sophia, she's the divine face of the hidden God, the unknown. She's all you're going to get. And she's fantastic, but she's reminding you that the universe, the cosmos, the gods, they are so far transcendent and so far beyond anything you ever can know, that for you to fall into some sort of dark depression because you think the gods are dead, I mean, come on. Corbin says of Nietzsche that Nietzsche's experience of the abyss was a failure of initiation.
Mhm.
And I don't even want to talk about what the pros and cons of that analysis of Nietzsche, but that's Corbin's take. No, 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 no. What happens? See, Corbin has the entire cosmology at his beck and call, so he can say, because God, the universe, creation is unknown and unknowable, that the closer you get to that realization, the closer you get to your own annihilation, fana. And Nietzsche got that far. And God is dead, and we have killed him. But Corbin says, talk to any accomplished Sufi master, and they'll tell you that, oh, no, no, after the annihilation comes the annihilation of the annihilation. and then you think, oh my God. And the whole world opens up for you. Now, you don't get that in Hillman, because he doesn't go there.
Mhm.
And one of the chief distinctions between Hillman and Corbin is that Hillman works with the darkness because that's what people bring him. and Corbin doesn't. He knows about it. He knows nature. He knows that the Sufi path is full of really tough stuff. Presumably, he himself experienced it, but as far as I am aware, he never writes about it. He writes that he knows it's there, but then he doesn't talk about it. So he's, in that sense, he's useless as a therapeutic helper unless you can read him as some people have, and I didn't put it this way until quite recently, as the writer of initiatic texts. That was an initiation because I had to take seriously, but not literally, that entire cosmology and to use it to free myself from my own imaginings of mastery or whatever they were. And I still, no one ever understands, but it worked. And so Jung is good for some things, Hillman's good for others, and then for some people, Corbin can, in spite of the fact that he's anything but a psychologist, he can show you things, or he can show you, because he would say, I can't show you anything, it's up to you. And which is very psychotherapeutic, it's up to you. But here's where you might look. That was a lot. What do you want to do?
So you've been sitting in silence. So any thoughts from your part?
Yeah, I've heard words image and imagination. And I'm reading right now a great Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy book, What is Art? And Tolstoy valued relations in society and also communication between people. And he says that at least as I got the main theme of this book, that art could be the tool for communication. What do you think about it?
Okay, what do I think about it? And that's the question I can answer.
Yes.
I mean, there's so I'm just this week I'm finishing up a 1 month course on Corbin's book on Ibn Arabi, and I have been thinking about this stuff in spite of myself since 1990, and so I now have some distance from Corbin. As to the point where for a while it was very unclear to me whether I could be objective about Corbin or whether I could distinguish what he thought from what I think. But that's starting to clarify a little bit. Since we've just been doing a lot about Corbin and his theological cosmology, I'll say that Corbin seems to have been quite conservative in a contemporary sense, a 20th century sense. He didn't have much patience for contemporary art, or to some extent literature, though he loved Rilke. He thought Rilke's poetry was fantastic. But he refers more than once to the decadence of contemporary art. And he at least says that he preferred the ancient arts, the arts of the ancient Persians and the arts of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the icons. He's a lover of icons and certain kinds of religious art. So we move him off to the side because what he provides for us, and what you see in Hillman, potentially, And what I think is true is that the arts are where so much of this work gets done. Oh, yeah, I get very excited about this. In fact, we were just talking about it yesterday. Yeah, so music. I'll make the Corbinian connection. Corbin talks about Andrei Rublev's icons, okay, and so that was super important for him. Which got me to Tarkovsky, who I didn't know about. So that was another great thing I got from Corbin. And he talks about icons, and he talks about music. Now he doesn't tell you whose music he likes, but he uses musical metaphors fairly frequently, and when he does, they are substantive components of his cosmology in a way that is medieval, really. Hundreds of years ago, and for many hundreds of years from the Greeks on in Western tradition, it was simply assumed that the structure of the cosmos was based on musical resonances. And Corbin is very much in that mode. And I think that we can bring that from him. And I won't go into details, but there are really good reasons to bring music into the discussion of the human place in nature, and to give it foregrounding. Now, that's maybe a little bit peculiar because there's no images in music explicitly, and we could set that whole topic aside for some other time. But then there are the visual arts as well. And, oh gosh, I mean, I have lots of thoughts about this. There's two things to be added, not so much to Corbin, but to what I get out of Corbin. And one of them is an account of images in the visual arts as they overlap with dream images and creative imagination, which is, I got to say, one of the primary terms in Corbin's lexicon, creative imagination. And so, yeah, that's where the arts come in. And relevant. So this is a little hard to put together from, yeah. A theology, no, I don't want to do that because I'm not ever going to be a theologian, but a nice fleshed out account of the visual arts from the perspective of Corbin's imaginal world has yet to be produced, at least as far as I know. What's closer to being I'm making this up as I go because it's stuff that I'm thinking about a lot right now. It's easier, let's put it that way. It's easier to see connections with music and with literature and poetry than to at least it is for me. And it is historically, because Corbin, except for his theory of icons, which I think is, that's the chapter. I love this stuff. You would take Corbin's theory of icons and you would bring it together with contemporary visual art. There are ways to do that. I know there are. I know there are ways to do that. In the world of music, that's easy. That's easy. But what I want to talk to you briefly about is the historical fact that when Corbin's works were first translated into English, they were published by Bollingen, by Princeton. And this was in the 50s and early 60s that he first became known in the United States. And it was the poets who lit up with this stuff. A few names that are big, if you know 20th century American poetry. There's Charles Olson and Robert Duncan and Diane de Prima and Anne Waldman and a handful of others who got hold of Corbin's books, and they thought, this is great. And one of the reasons for that, actually, well, let's do this, actually overlaps with Corbin's copy of Being in Time. Okay, because what Corbin saw in Shiravardi's mystical Islam and in Heidegger's Being in Time was the central role of hermeneutics. That is the interpretation of the word. And for Shiravardi, it's primarily the interpretation of the Quran. Though even in the Quran, God says, you know, I basically created everything, and so it's all open to interpretation. And Corbin's very clear about his own enthusiasm for interpreting the real world the same way you interpret dreams, because for Corbin, they're both images in a very Hillmanian way, really, you know. And so hermeneutics is central for Corbin. And that's the part of him that the poets got excited about, along with other things, because they thought he's taking language as seriously as we do as a spiritually transformative practice. And okay, so Corbin's putting it in this theological context, which perhaps we don't need to adopt. But here's this guy who understands what we do when we are writing at our most intense. It's like the ancient and contemporary Catholic practice of Lectio Divina. Very much. You read the Bible as if it were written for you. And Corbin has a whole treatment of hermeneutics as not as absolutely escaping from the literal text. And in fact, this is one of those many central themes of Corbin's entire work. And one of the things that I found and continue to find most exciting, he says, the problem with the religions, with the monotheisms, is that they go off the rails and they become institutionalized, and they think that because they've got a book, that they understand what it means, when any decent mystic, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, any mystic says, well, I mean, yeah, it means what it means, but you've got to do the interpretations. And I learned this, and it's still, I think, fun and helpful for people. In the early written languages, both Hebrew and Arabic, there were no vowels. There were no notations for the vowels. And without the vowels, you know what the word is. It could be this or that or the other thing. And in both Hebrew and Arabic, those are very image-heavy languages. And wow, I mean, those of us who grew up with alphabetic scripts, that's really intense, to think that the tradition of hermeneutics began because these early early believers, these early followers of Moses and Jesus, no, it's not so much true of the, see, that's the thing with Christianity. It's not so much true. And that's a long story that Corbin likes to tell. But at least the Hebrew and the Arabic, wow, you had to do commentaries because you know, and one of the things that Corbin says in an essay, I can't remember where it is, he says, and he's referring to the Marxists who were in Paris in the 40s and 50s, and he was sort of tongue-in-cheek saying, I'm not calling for a permanent revolution, I'm calling for a permanent hermeneutics. Because otherwise the text freezes in its meaning, and then it becomes dangerous. Because if the meaning is only the literal meaning, then you have the truth, and you become instantly very dangerous. And I'm sorry to get off the arts, but you see, for Corbin, what keeps the religion alive is the same thing that keeps the arts alive. That you need to be at the edges of the creative imagination. You know what happens in the arts. I mean, you know, look at the French Art Academy at the turn of the last century, you know, and all the Impressionists, they couldn't even get shown in those because the art had just become historical, and here are the things you have to show in your painting. And that happens all the time, happens every generation. And in spite of the fact that Corbin's not himself very interested in contemporary art, his overall project is no, where the interesting things happen is always on the edges of orthodoxy, which is why he picks these weird mystics to get excited about. Swedenborg, even. Corbin is really excited about Swedenborg and Burma and Mullasadra and Shurvardi, and Ibn Arabi's not thought very highly of these days in certain circles. You know, so he was always going to the edges of these traditions. And because that's where the religions stay alive. The Pope would say, yes, but it's also where they go wrong. And Corbin would have to agree, yeah. And how do you decide? And he's not going to give you any rules. See, that's where it stays Protestant in a funny way, depending on how you understand Protestantism. You know, I mean, the Catholics were not wrong about what would happen after Luther. I mean, it's just a free-for-all. There's Protestants everywhere, and they all believe something different. You know, and Corbin is certainly aware of that danger, but he's much more afraid of rigidity. And that's something he shares with Hillman. And so, you go to the arts, you go to the poets who are in a process of perpetually rethinking, reimaging, reimagining, rewriting. You go to the artists who are trying to do the next thing, which may totally not be any interest at all, but they risk their careers on trying something new, and the ones that don't succeed, nobody remembers, you know, and until sometime later, you know, 100 years later, whoa, that was really pretty good. And, you know, and the Pope would come and say, see, it's got to be around a long time before we can decide. And so you get this sort of perpetual problem of expansion and contraction. And I think you see that in, if not in Corbin himself, then certainly in the cosmology that he brought to us.
Well, we've got like 15 minutes left. Let's just
yeah, sorry.
reroute a little bit. One thing that I'm very interested, I mean, for me was a very crucial bit of your book. You cite Edward Casey, who says that we should because of the centrality of imagination in this story, that you should distinguish three kinds of imagination: conscious imagining, active imagination, and kind of imagination as a way to Mundus Imaginalis. Could you just unpack that a little bit?
No, but I know Ed. He's a great guy. And he's really smart. You know, I mean, I think about those issues all the time. And I don't have a good answer. And I think you can sketch in answers, and let's try that. And it's important in understanding Corbin because the way I understand imagination, and certainly the way Hillman understood it, is a long distance from Corbin's notion of the very special, very fragile Mundus Imaginalis. And I cannot, let's see, how do I say this? It's because in so many ways Corbin gave birth to me. I always have trouble criticizing him, and also because he's a lot smarter than I am, and he knows a lot more. But I cannot manage to keep my understanding of imagination usefully confined to that special place of what he calls the conjoined imagination. There's a section we were just looking at in his book on Ibn Arabi where you have this, because God basically is the grand imaginer, but you know, this is one of the three monotheisms. We were created in his image, and therefore our creative imagination partakes in some degree of the divine imagination. That's what makes us connected to the entirety of the cosmos, really. But then Corbin is quite clear over and over again that there's a distinction between what Paracelsus called the vera imaginatio and fantasy. And that's why he kind of fell out with Hillman. I don't know the details, and I wish someone who would write a biography, but Corbin was very unhappy with what Hillman and David Miller and others were doing with his very special idea of the Mundus Imaginalis. And I'm confident that he was worried that it was being secularized and degraded because he saw because for Corbin, I think let's try this. I've never said this out loud, but this must be true. That for Corbin, you had to have one of those moments of Gnostic download, wrong word, of Gnostic inspiration, Gnostic revelation, in order to truly see into the Mundus Imaginalis. It could happen in dreams, and it could happen in a waking state. And when that happens, you're in a world of those objective images, you know, objective with quotes, because somebody else isn't seeing it. So it's, from the point of view of normal people, ontologically quite peculiar, because you're seeing something that is absolutely true and objective, and you're the only one seeing it. See, I think Jung and Corbin saw this in each other's eyes, and they knew, but both of them also knew that their visions were individual and individuating, you know. There's so much to say. So, okay, so there's that. that's the Mundus Imaginalis for Corbin. But then Ibn Arabi, as Corbin will tell us, also says that, well, from one point of view, everything is imagination. That's Hillman for me. And the distinction, yeah, okay, this is actually good. So I think everything is imagination, but then I really need an ontology for that. And it can't be Corbin's ontology because Corbin's still working with a pre-modern ontology. I have sometimes suggested that if Corbin had been able to live another 100 years and he had seen what some of the 20th and now 21st century theologians, particularly the women, or particularly those who've been touched by what we like to call feminist theory, have been trying to do with theological thought, that he might have been able to give up some of his pre-modern framings for the Mundus Imaginalis. I'm sorry, this just goes forever because as soon as you poke it, it's impossible. So there's this special place, which is, Corbin will say, in between the sensible and, well, he says different things, but we'll go with, it's between the sensible world that we all share and the Deus absconditus. And that is the Mundus Imaginalis. And I think we have to say that the only way of access is by divine revelation. He says that. And that would be a Gnostic transfer. Well, at that point, well, what about me? I don't get those, what about me? And Corbin would say, well, and I'm mostly quoting, it's very rare individuals who can do that and get in contact with their angels. And then you get, you get transcendent knowledge. But at the same time, he says all knowledge comes that way. And so there's this, in my reading with Corbin, there's this terrible gap between the elect few, like Ibn Arabi, and maybe Henri, pretty sure, and Jung, and people like me who don't get that. And I want it. And from my contemporary viewpoint, the ontological distinction can't be that absolute. And there's places in Corbin where it surely seems not to be. It has to be more of a degradation, if you will, and more of a continuity than that special place. And so I've just sort of given him his Mundus Imaginalis. And I have to say that everything else is also imagination. And that's philosophically really suspect. You got to be very, very careful, because if it's all imagination, then what do you mean by imagination? I think, anyway. So let's go with the rest of what Ed says. So that's the Mundus Imaginalis, very special, and not very many people actually get to see that. Certainly, I don't think, I don't know, maybe a little bit, but not so that you knew, and yet I know the imagination is what keeps me alive and what keeps me excited. And I know it connects me with something like divinity and something like life. And so now we need to have Ed come in and work with what's left for the plebeians, the rest of us who don't get Gnostic downloads. And now it gets really interesting. Okay. And I think more complicated, there are, I shouldn't even say this. Don't write this down, but I actually think that after putting it off for 35 years, I may have to read some Gilles Deleuze, because I have an intuition that what Gilles Deleuze was up to, although it's not Corbin in many ways, and I don't understand, I don't know anything about Deleuze, but he seems to have a vision of the ontological reality of the world, which shares some of Corbin, some aspects of the changeable fluidity which is accessible to us via the imagination. And so when I use Corbin, I set aside those parts of him that are devoted to keeping the Mundus Imaginalis safe from people like me. I know how powerful it is, and so what that gives us, and I actually think there's a lot of philosophers and theologians who are doing this as we speak. They're working with the world in a way that's totally distinct from the way philosophers worked before the turn of the 20th century. You could point to Heidegger if you want to, but he's not the only kind of way of doing this. After the collapse of a simplistic division between matter and spirit, after that all collapsed, we need what Ed Casey is suggesting we need, which is a taxonomy of, and I gotta address this because you mentioned it, and it's something that also comes up in Corbin, but then tends to disappear. And I've been trying to bring it out more and more recently. See, there's no social theology in Corbin. Because he's so interested in the individuation that comes with the Gnostic vision, which I find problematic. If that was all there was, it'd be super problematic. But he's got two other parts of his story which save him for me. And one is his reliance on the figure of the feminine, which we've barely mentioned here. And it's absolutely crucial for Corbin's understanding of reality. And that was another thing that he shared with Jung. I mean, Jung famously said, yeah, Christianity, all three of those male figures, no, this is bad. You've got to have the feminine or you're just in serious trouble. I mean, he wasn't actually himself much of a feminist in the contemporary sense, but he knew that was lacking, okay? Corbin knew it too. And we could talk for 20 hours about Corbin's reliance on Sophia and the divine feminine. And I mean, there's a very great deal in Corbin about that. But the other component, which is part of that, is right at the center of his book on Ibn Arabi. And that's his notion of the divine twin. You in each being of light, whether you're a stone or a flower or a human being, has a divine counterpart. And this kind of correspondence theory of reality, not in the modern philosophical sense, but correspondences in the theological and cosmological sense. Ivan Illich, one of my favorite people to read about religion, says, every culture that I know of, he said, except the modern West, assumed that there was a complementarity between divine things and things down here. And he says, somewhere we lost that, and that's terrible. Well, Corbin is trying to resurrect it. And he's quite clear that the way you have to resurrect it, this divine dualism, the divine twin, is first by admitting that your angel exists. And he says, because we've lost the idea of the imagination as an organ of perception, except unless you're a poet or a painter or a dancer or a musician. You see, I mean, they have in practice, all the artists have in practice, whether they theorize it or not, they have the experience of imagination as an organ of creation and perception. And the archetype of that dualism of creating and perceiving at the same time for Corbin, and he says for Ibn Arabi, is prayer. And the most puzzling part the first time you read his book on Ibn Arabi is that he says quite explicitly, more than once, that the vassal, and pardon the gendered constructions, but that's what Corbin and Ibn Arabi used. The vassal and his lord, the vassal creates the lord. He creates with his imagination his God, his angel, but it's a two-way street. The angel needs him as much as he needs the angel. And so they're co-creating each other in the moments of the most intense prayer. And that creative imagination at that extremely high level is the archetype of every act of interaction down here. And they're to shift this into another kind of discourse entirely. If you're at all familiar with any of the ecological discourse in any of its guises, whether it's literary or scientific or whatever, participation and mutuality are now, the recognized grounding for any kind of ecological relationship to the planet. And Corbin is right there. I mean, he talks rather about your angel, but I'll finish by saying, but when he does that, he's very often drawing on Ficino and Proclus and the Neoplatonists who recognize the divinity in flowers and rocks and animals. And it's that same sense of anima mundi that you can find in Hillman.
Right, right.
I get excited. This is really cool stuff.
So, just if you have time, a very brief question. Something from you to end up with, or to wrap up with?
Very shortly.
Yeah, shortly.
I read your essay, twofold idolatry.
Adultery.
Yeah.
And you wrote that to understand Corbin's world, you have to be in it, can't be understood from outside.
Mm-hmm.
And then you refer Corbin's interiority and exteriority, and refers that it's not the space, but it's a quality of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Very briefly.
Just
to comment very briefly.
Yeah. If you try to understand what he's bringing us analytically, the way in which a bad professor of literature would have you analyze a poem, you will never understand any of the arts or Corbin. So read Corbin the way you would read a great novel or a great poem, and let it work on you.
Mm-hmm.
And where would you start with Corbin?
I would start with his book on Ibn Arabi, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. And I have taught it, not a lot, but I have taught it to undergraduate students. And it can be done, but unless you're coming to it as the master scholar of all of human history, the way you have to read it is, don't be intimidated by it, because he's simply assuming that you know all this stuff. So he brings in names and dates and histories and ideas, and don't let it worry you that you don't know what he's talking about, because his language, just read it for the little bits, and it may only be little bits that seem beautiful to you, and keep two things in mind. One is merely technical. Always take a look at the footnotes, because although some of them are just citations, many of them are long and important. And the other thing is, recognize that he's expounding this material, although he is in some sense deeply masterful with it, he's also struggling with it himself. And so he'll come to the same things over and over. And sometimes his sentences are really long. And you have to just sort of back off from it and say, well, I think this is what he must mean, and then go on. And that if you read it in that way, like a really difficult poem, then you can get things out of it.
All right. It's just a very, really the very, very last question.
That's fine.
If one were to get an introduction to archetypal psychology, what just the first, what is it? What would be the one book that you would go after?
Well, I'm kind of torn, because there is the little, Spring Publications has been publishing those collected volumes, and the first volume is called, it's quite short, and it's called Archetypal Psychology: A Brief Account.
And say Springer?
Yeah, Spring. No, not Springer. It's Spring Publications. Klaus Ottman, Ottman, is the editor, and he was a quite close friend of Hillman. And it's volume 1 in what do they call it? The collected edition, I think. And it's called Archetypal Psychology: A Brief Account. And that, although it's not beautiful, it was written by Hillman. And it has additional material. It's been in several editions. Right. And this is the latest edition, has added material. So I think that's probably the place to start. The reason I was slightly of two minds about it is because it's not one of his best books, but it's the best introduction.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. Good luck doing something with it.